Recommendations in Dynamicweb. My name is Mikkel Ricci and I'm a developer evangelist at Dynamicweb. And today I will talk a bit about recommendations in general and go into more details on how to use recommendations in Dynamicweb. First, to set the stage, I will give a general overview of what recommendations are and how they can be used in Dynamicweb. For providing recommendations in Dynamicweb, we use a system called Apache Mahout that can recommend products to customers. And we have built a wrapper around Apache Mahout to make it easy to interface to a recommendation service from Dynamicweb. And when we have recommendations in Mahout up and running, we can get recommendations in real time from Mahout, and we can show recommendations to users. And as we will see in a few minutes, the recommendations that we show can depend on a number of things, a context basically. It can be the products that a user is currently viewing, it can be the products that a user has viewed, or products in the cart, and so on. To get these recommendations up and running, we first need a recommendation service. And this recommendation service is an Apache Mahout server with a REST API on top, and then we can ask this recommendation service to get recommendations. Internally, Mahout needs some data to build recommendation models that it can use to recommend products based on users and what similar users find interesting. So in order to make recommendations work, we need to export some data from Dynamicweb to our recommendation service. And when we have data exported to our recommendation service, the recommendation service will build internal recommendation models and use those models to provide recommendations in real time to display in Dynamicweb. And the recommendation service we have, it must be accessible via HTTP from the Dynamicweb server. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a public recommendation server, but the important thing is that the Dynamicweb server must be able to access the recommendation server. And as mentioned, the service builds a number of models internally, and then each model can be used from Dynamicweb to recommend products depending on some parameters that will depend on user behavior on the site or what products are shown on the product page, for instance. Here's a brief overview of how all this works. On the right here, we have Dynamicweb, and Dynamicweb generates a very simple data file that basically tells that a user has a relation to a product, and then it has a preference, this relation. And in this, our current setup, we always use 1 as preference, which basically means that the user has either bought or viewed the product, and then we have a list of all users with their relations to the products in Dynamicweb. This data file, this comma-separated values, are then exported to the Mahout server or the recommendation service, and then the recommendation service builds an internal model where it stores the relations between users and products, as illustrated on the left here, where we can see that this user has relations to all these fruits and berries, and then from the relations between users and products, the recommendation service is able to predict what another user will probably like depending on what similar users like. So that's a very brief overview of what actually goes on, how the technical stuff works. Today I will talk most about how we use the recommendation service from within Dynamicweb and not go into much detail on how Mahout and the recommendation service work internally. And then when we start using recommendations, there are some questions that are relevant to ask. The first thing is, does it work? And the simple answer to that is yes, it works. It's based on mathematics, and it's proven to work because people that are similar and like stuff, but when we know something about people, what they like, then it turns out that then we can then use that information to predict what people that like some of the same stuff, what they will like. And a question that naturally comes along when we talk e-commerce, for instance, is, does recommendations have any effect on sales? And there the answer is yes, if used correctly. And I will show you in a few minutes how to implement this in Dynamicweb. And of course, the better implementation and use of recommendations you do, the more effect it will have on your sales. And then how can we be sure that the recommendations are good? And we know that it works technically, but we have to make sure that we use it correctly. And then the only way we can actually prove that it works is to test it in real life with real users to see that our recommendations are implemented correctly and they increase the sales on our solution. And it takes some time to see if recommendations have any effect. One thing is that we have to collect enough user data. So we need statistics enabled in Dynamicweb, so we know a lot about user behavior on the site. And it takes some time to collect this data. And of course, the more data we have, the better recommendations we can provide. For those of you that are interested in knowing some more about the technical details of recommendations, I recommend that you read this book called Mahout in Action. It gives a good overview of what is actually going on, and then also goes into more detail on some of the technical stuff inside the recommendation service. But today I will focus on how to use recommendations in Dynamicweb. And basically the way we do it is that a user views a product page, and then we perform an asynchronous call to the recommendation service. And then if our recommendation service recommends any products, we show them on the page. The reason for doing it asynchronously using AJAX calls is simply to improve performance. So we don't have to wait for recommendations before we can display our products, for instance. Now I will show you a demo of how to get recommendations up and running in Dynamicweb. I'll switch over to my browser here. So here we have Dynamicweb with the recommendations module installed. And the first thing we need to do in Dynamicweb is to define a recommendation model for our recommendation service. And I have my recommendation service running on this local machine, but as mentioned before, it can run on any server that is accessible via HTTP from Dynamicweb. So I go into the Management Center, e-commerce, recommendations, and then models. And here I create the models I will be using in my recommendations. Today I will show how to create just one model to keep things clear, but you can actually define more models in your system and you try out different model parameters to see what recommendations make most sense in your cases. So I click New Model. Then I get a message up here that the recommendation service is not available. And that basically means right now that I haven't told this model where the recommendation service is located, but I will do that in a couple of seconds. First, I give my model a name, just my recommendation model. Then I have to put in the service URL, and that's the URL for my recommendation service. And I'm running on this local machine on port 8080, and then I need to append REST/recommend to get to the REST API that the recommendation service exposes. Then I have to give my model a unique ID on the recommendation service. Here we'll just use my recommendation model. So now I'm actually ready to create my model. So if I save it, you see that the warning goes away, and now my model is created on the recommendation service. Model parameters are used internally by Mahout to compute its recommendation models, and for this demonstration I'll just leave those as they are, but you can read on in Mahout in Action what these actually mean and how you can tweak them to get recommendations that are better suited for your actual needs. Then we need to define how to export data to our recommendation service. And that's in the data export schedule. The first thing is to decide on what kind of data we will export. Currently, we support 4 types of exports. We have bought product session and bought product user. And that's information coming from the e-commerce orders on which users have bought which products. And the one bought product session is based on statistics data, where we just have sessions, and bought product user is based on authenticated users. So this makes sense if you require your users to sign in before they can place orders. But apart from this product session includes all users, both authenticated and anonymous users. But this one product user only exports data on authenticated users bought products. Similarly, we have viewed product for both session-based and viewed product user for user-based, so authenticated users that have seen products. For this example, I will use viewed product user. So I use information on products that has been viewed by authenticated users. Then I can define when my data should be exported from Dynamicweb to the recommendation service, and we need to define a start time and then how often it should happen. I'll just set it to 5 minutes. And then, as mentioned previously, the recommendation service needs to build internal models for computing recommendations. And we can have the service rebuild its internal models whenever we complete an export from Dynamicweb. So I recommend that you check this rebuild service model after export to make sure that the recommendation service rebuilds its models when you have exported new data. Then we have some caching settings so we can actually cache recommendations in Dynamicweb, so we don't have to get recommendations from our recommendation service. Again, it's to improve performance because there can be some latency when we call our external recommendation service. But for now, I'll just leave it at none. But of course, if you only export data once every 6 hours or similar, it will make sense to cache the recommendations in the same amount of time. But for now, I'll just disable caching and set up a repeat interval up here. I'll just save my model. Down here, we have a service schedule, and that's a schedule we can define on the recommendation service for when it should rebuild this model internally. When we have this checkmark rebuild service model after export, these settings down here are not really needed. But depending on your setup, it may make sense to have the recommendation service rebuild its internal models at a regular interval. But for now, I'll just leave it like this to show you how it works. So I save my model, and of course now I could wait for the data export to run using a scheduled task, but I'll just click this export now. So we now have exported our data to our recommendation service, and now we just have to wait a few seconds for the recommendation service to build its models, and then it's ready to recommend products. So now we have defined our recommendation model in Dynamicweb, and it has been created on the recommendation service. And I'd like to just show you actually what our service returns. If I open this URL, then we can see here that our recommendation service now has this model, my recommendation model, and we're ready to get recommendations from this service. The next thing to do is to go into our content and add a module for showing recommendations. And we have created a Dynamicweb module for that you can attach to a paragraph. So I'll create a new paragraph, give it a name, of course, and then I will add the recommendations module. And here are the settings for the recommendations module. The first thing we do is that we pick a template that we will use to show our recommendations, and I will show that in a short while how it actually works. Of course, in our template, we basically show products. So we can use settings from a product catalog to get settings on images and where to show product details with this setting. And then I'll go back to the rendering settings in a few minutes. And then I'll jump down to the model settings. Here we pick the recommendation model that we want to use to show recommendations. I only have one, so I pick that one. Then we can tell how many recommendations we want to get from our recommendation service. The default value is 8, but you can change it to anything you like. One important thing to notice about this number of recommendations is that it's the number of recommendations that you will get from the recommendation service. And depending on how your e-commerce solution is set up, it may not be possible to show all recommendations. So if you get 8 recommended products from the recommendation service, then it might only be possible to show 5 of the products, because maybe if a product is out of stock, then of course you should not recommend it because your user cannot buy it and similar stuff. So this is the number of recommendations that you get from the recommendation service, but the actual number of recommendations that you can show in Dynamicweb may be less than the number of recommendations. Down here we have the possibility to exclude products from recommendation using a smart search. So if there are certain products that you will never recommend, then you can add those to a smart search and exclude those. I'll just save that. Then I would like to show you how this looks like right now, and we're not completely done yet, but now we should be able to show or see that we actually get some recommendations back from our model. So I open this page, and here we have the products. I show 9 products, and down here we have our recommendations. I'll just move this recommendations paragraph to the top to make it easier to see when we reload the page. So now we have them at the top. You can see there's the way I render the products is not very good, because I don't show the right images and I only show the product names, but of course I should show prices and stuff like that, but I'll get back to that in a few minutes. One thing to notice with this is that, I'll just go show you the template to show what actually goes on. Here I have a recommendations model, and I've written a short description up here on what this template actually does. And I'd like to show you just quickly the interesting stuff that you get here. There are actually 2 template tags that makes all this work. Now I have added template tags, and then I will reload my recommendation product. What we can see here is that we get 2 template tags, one called recommendation URL base, that's this short URL, and then we get one called recommendations URL. This recommendations URL base is something that we can use in our template to dynamically compute a URL that we want to use for getting recommendations. And recommendations URL, that's a URL that Dynamicweb will compute for us. And this one depends on the settings on our module. So I'll just jump back to the settings on the module to show you what actually goes on. Down here in recommendation type, we pick how we want to recommend products. Mahout can recommend products based on 2 things. It can recommend products based on a list of product IDs, or it can recommend products based on a known user. In the data I exported, I have known authenticated users ID in my export data, so I can actually recommend products based on an authenticated user, and then Mahout can find similar users and give recommendations based on what they prefer. So here we can pick if we want to recommend based on items, that's product IDs, or based on a user. And this only makes sense if a user is signed in to Dynamicweb in the front end. But let's take a look at this item. Here we show recommendations based on products. And then we can compute a product path that's basically a list of products and especially their IDs. And currently we only have one. We have viewed product in session. And that's a list of the products most recently viewed in this session. And then we get 8 of those. If I change this 8 to 2 and go back to my front end and reload the page, then you will see that now this recommendations URL contains only 2 product IDs up here. So now we get recommendations based only on the last 2 products that we have seen. If I copy this and open it in a new tab, then you can see what actually is returned to from this call. So what we get, and this is all done asynchronously, so we load this URL in JavaScript and then we render the products. So here you see the output that comes back to our page. So we get a list of products that are recommended, and in this case we get 6 products, but we actually asked Mahout for 8 products, if I remember correctly. Yeah, we asked Mahout for 8 recommendations, and we can only show 6 of those. And actually, I don't know right now how many Mahout recommends, but we can try to change that to 4 and reload this page. And now we should at most get 4 products. So now we get 3 products. So, and I reload this page, then I have the 3 products that are recommended. But basically, from our template, we make an AJAX call to this page, and then we render these products in our template. I will later show you how these products are actually rendered by Dynamicweb. So it's actually Dynamicweb that calls the recommendation service and gets a response back from the recommendation service, and then from that response, Dynamicweb loads products and makes those products available for use in our template. Okay, we can see here that these recommendations are not really useful. They're not very beautiful, and it's if you take a look at the template, you'll see there's a lot of geeky stuff going on, and that's really not very useful. So instead, you are welcome to take a look at this template, but now I will show you a somewhat easier way to show recommendations in Dynamicweb. So I will go into my recommendations module settings, and then I will pick another template. I will pick one called recommendations context, and then I will check this checkbox down here, render recommendations. Now what will happen is that rather than getting this raw JSON feed from Dynamicweb, we can actually have Dynamicweb render the products. The reason for us wanting that is that if you take a look at this, you will see what we have, the price on the product, but that's the raw price coming from the database. So we don't really have any information on any discounts that are applied to this product, and it will be quite hard work to render this as a product as we're used to in Dynamicweb. So now I go into my recommendation settings here. I check render recommendations. Then I pick a product catalog that I want to render the recommendations with, and I pick the one called products on my product list page, and then I save and close my model. Now if I reload my recommendations page here, we can see that there's something wrong. Let me just check the settings. Sorry, I forgot to save after. I get recommendations context like this. Then I reload my page. And now I get recommendations, and they are rendered just like these products on my page. And you can see up here that we have paging and stuff like that, that doesn't really make sense on our recommendations list, but we can fix that as well. We can go into our recommendations module setup, and then we can override the product list template used in this paragraph up here. So just pick one called product list no pagination, save and close, and reload my page. So now we have a very simple or a very nice looking display of our recommended products, and then are shown just like our regular products on the site. And you can see that we actually have now information on discounts. We can see this is the regular price and the discount price, and now we're using Dynamicweb to render the products, and the product rendering template is just like any product list template that we know how to use. And the details will, of course, now I use a separate page for showing product details, and that works as well. So basically, we're rendering the recommended products. We have Dynamicweb render them for us, so we don't have to do that in JavaScript. And if we take a look at the output, rather than getting a list of products, we simply get a single property content that contains the rendered output. So that's the recommended way to use recommendations in Dynamicweb. I mentioned these two URLs that Dynamicweb provide. It provides the recommendations URL base, that's this one, and then it computes a recommendations URL that depends on the settings on the module. We can also use the context, and when we do that, then we have to make sure that in our template that we actually ignore this recommendations URL and then compute one ourselves. And that's actually what this template does. So rather than using this recommendations URL that's computed by Dynamicweb, it uses the recommendations URL base, and then it looks on the page to find products that are currently shown, and then it provides recommendations based on those. So this list, the parameters up here, actually depends on what we're currently showing on this page. And now we're showing 9 products. But if I change that to 3 products, for instance, then you see now we only show 3 products, and then our recommendations change because now we are recommending products based on these pages down here. And similarly, if I go to page 2, we will see other products, and then we will get recommendations based on those products. And that's all handled in the template. I can just quickly show you how what the basic idea is. We have built a simple JavaScript library that can help you get the products query from the context. And basically what it does is that it looks for, I'll just show you the code here. It looks for attributes like this. So it looks for data-product-id, scans the entire page for those, and builds a list of those and use those for recommending products. And then of course you can do a lot of cool stuff. We can also recommend based on the products we have in the cart. So let's just open a couple of products and add them to the cart. So now we have 2 products in our cart. And then we can see we don't have any recommendations now. And we're basing the recommendations on what we have in our cart. Let's just check why it doesn't work. It's probably the template that's wrong. It's template cart. Sorry, we have to go to the cart. Yeah, so there we have it. So now we're basing the recommendations on the content of our cart. So we're using this base URL, ignoring this, and then we're computing this because we have these 2 products in the cart. If I remove this knitted hat from my cart, then I get other recommendations because I ask for recommendations based on just a single product. As mentioned before, we can also recommend based on users, and let me just show that. I'll have a simple page I can use here for signing in, just to show what happens. Just sign in this user. So now I'm an authenticated user. Now I can go into my product page with the recommendations, and now rather than letting Dynamicweb compute a URL based on the items I have seen, I will pick user. And then of course I have to pick a template that doesn't ignore this URL that Dynamicweb computes. So now let's reload our products page. And now we get recommendations based on the user. And of course, this only makes sense when Mahout knows that there is a user with this ID. So in order to use user-based recommendations like this, you have to export data that includes user IDs from your user management setup. So that's a quick introduction to how you can implement recommendations in Dynamicweb. And of course, you have to work a bit with it to make it look good, and you have to find the best ways to recommend the products. In this example, I'm adding recommendations to a product list that may not make much sense. Maybe it makes more sense to only have recommendations on a product detail page like this. But that all depends on your setup and what your customer prefers. And of course, you should use split testing or similar means to test what actually works the best. We have seen these responses that we get from a recommendation service where from our template, we make an AJAX call back to Dynamicweb due to the usual cross-domain scripting limitations. But of course, behind the scenes, Dynamicweb is making calls to our actual recommendation service. So I'll just show you a log file that we're generating when calling recommendations. It sits in here in system logs. And that log file actually shows exactly what is going on. We have it in here, down here. Just pulled it up in a new frame. So there's a lot of stuff. And down here we can see there are some exceptions are logged as well if something goes wrong. And then we can see down here that whenever we perform a request, if we check this timestamp, I'll just take another look at our recommendations. When I reload 255.53, if I reload this log, then I get a new line. And you can see down here that we call get recommendations, and what Dynamicweb is actually calling is this URL. Let's see if I can copy it like this and put it up here. And now we will see the response that our recommendation service actually provides. So we ask it for 4 recommendations and based on this user. And then it returns, in this case, 4 recommendations because that makes sense. And it returns a product ID and it returns a score. And the higher the score, the more relevant these products are. So in this case, this M6010 at shop 1 is the most relevant of these 4 products. And then we have Dynamicweb render those products. I pull this one up. So basically Dynamicweb gets this response and then converts it into this, where now it's rendering the product. If I change that back, we can see, let me just change that one like this. So you can see basically here we are just sending along this user ID. So Dynamicweb gets this response from the recommendation service and converts it into this. And now it's just raw information on the products. And then of course we could handle that in our template, or we could use this render products setting to make it more easy to work with in our template. One final thing I'd like to show you is that rather than using asynchronous AJAX calls to render these recommendations, we can actually render them directly into the template. And if we do that, we're doing everything server-side. In cases where the user is going to your website and browsing your website, it will probably be best to use AJAX calls. But if you want to send out newsletters or things like that, where you have to generate static content, then it can make sense to render the recommendations directly into the page output. And we can do that by checking this render recommendations in template and then pick another template, and we get the one called render loop. So now I'm going to go back to my products page here and reload the page. Then I get that it's my template that's something wrong with, but now it's actually all done server side. So Dynamicweb calls the recommendation service, gets back the product IDs, converts them into products, and then it actually uses the product renderer to render the products. And you can do this to generate everything server side. And when I open the template here, you'll see something that should be very familiar. We have a loop called recommendations, but it's basically a products loop, and the way you render it is just as you do with any products loop. So using this trick, you can actually get your recommendations server side and render them into the template, and then you don't have to rely on JavaScript to render your recommendations on a page. So that's recommendations in Dynamicweb, the end of the demo.